In this video, you're going to learn how to use the Radial Mask in Lightroom. Now, before I do a demonstration, what I'd like to do is go through just a few slides that introduce you to the Radial Mask and show you some of the settings and show you some of the basic properties of how the Radial Mask can be used. So there are many mask types that you can use in Lightroom. Specifically here, we're looking at the Radial Mask, which can be created by going to the Create New Mask pane and selecting Radial Gradient. Radial masks or radial gradient masks are used to create circular or oval-shaped mask areas. Here, the adjustments are strongest at the center, and then the adjustments gradually fade as you move towards the edges. Radial masks are used for very specific circumstances. Sometimes you're looking to draw attention to specific parts of an image. They're also used frequently for creating vignettes. They can be used to create or to highlight a subject, and they can also be used to subtly enhance light around a specific point. Right. So your radial gradient masks, they can be circular or they can have kind of an elliptical type structure. Once you've created a radial gradient mask, you're going to see some handles that are part of the mask itself. You've got both external handles and internal handles. The external handles can be used to do things like rotate, resize, and control the aspect ratio. And the way you control these is basically with your mouse or your trackpad, is to simply select and drag any of these handles to either rotate them, resize them, or change the aspect ratio. Now, if you're looking to rotate, there's going to be a little bit different cursor. You're not going to see the points that you see here. On the external handles, there's actually kind of an arrow, kind of a bending arrow that allows you to rotate the radial mask. We'll see that when I do some demonstrations. Now you've also got internal handles. The internal handles are used to move the mask around on the photo, and they're also used to adjust the size and shape of the radial mask. And finally, they're also used to control feathering. The center handle, the blue dot kind of right in the center of the radial gradient mask, that is the handle that you use to move the entire mask. So basically you're going to use your cursor or your trackpad, click on that and drag it to a different location if you need to move the entire mask to a different location. All right, so in just a few minutes we'll get to a demonstration that shows you exactly how to create these and how to manipulate them in different ways. Before we do that, let's talk about the feather adjustments that you can make. So you do have the ability with these radial gradients to include a feather adjustment. On the radial gradient panel, there is a feather setting. By default, it's going to be set to 50. And the idea here is that the larger the value, the more softening you have around the edges of the mask. A value of 0, there's no softening at all, right? So when you apply a value of 0 for your feather, essentially everything everything that's covered by the entire radial gradient mask will have the properties applied equally. Now, as you go to something like 50, which is the default, you'll notice that there's some softening around the edges. And then as you go higher than that, and the highest you can go here is 100. Once you go to 100 with the feather adjustment, that is the most softening of the edges of the mask that you can get. Right? And what you're going to use here kind of depends on what you're trying to accomplish with the mask. But you do have the ability to control the effects that are applied and how they're applied as you move outward from the center of the mask. All right, so that's going to bring us to the end of this section. In the next section, what we'll do is actually do a demo. In the first part of this demo, like I have in the past demos, I'm going to use a white background as a starting point. And just to kind of reiterate why I do that, when you have a white background, it makes it easier to understand all the different properties and all the different settings that can be applied with these masks, and just kind of gives you a better understanding of how they work before you actually start applying them to a photo. So the first part of this demonstration is just going to use a white background. To get this started, we will come over and click on the mask section, the Create New Mask section. And again, we're working with radial gradients here, so I'll select radial gradient. And now at this point, I can simply draw in the size and location of that gradient anywhere on the photo. So you simply start dragging. The default is going to be a circle, like you see here. But of course, you can change that if you want more of an elliptical type shape, or you can just kind of move your mouse around to create that. So that creates your initial mask, and your mask is going to have two sets of handles. You have your external handles. Those are the ones that border the mask, and you have your internal handles as well. So we'll start with the external handles, and these are very easy to use. You can use your mouse or your trackpad to simply drag any of the handles in any direction you want to go to change the shape or to change the size. If you want to rotate the mask, you simply hover your mouse over the external line, and you'll notice that my cursor is now changed to a double arrow. And with that double arrow, then you can simply move or rotate your mask as needed. So you can simply move it around, rotate it however you need to rotate it. And you can do that from any of the sides. Right? As long as you're not on one of the main handles, you can change or you can rotate the mask as needed. So that's the external handles. And then your internal handles, at the very center of the radial gradient mask, you have a blue dot. And that blue dot is just the indicator for, well, it's the centroid of the mask, but using that point, you can pick the mask up and drag it to a different location. So it's used to move the mask around on the photo should you need to do that. And then the internal handle, you can drag that inward. And as you drag it inward, the further in you go, the more of a gradient you're going to get, right? So it's going to result in a smoother differential between the center of the mask and the external area of the mask. So it results in a smoother transition for the mask the further you drag that in. And you'll notice as you do that, if you look over on the radial gradient panel, as you're dragging, you'll notice that these numbers change. And so the closer you get to 100, the more gradual that transition zone will be between the internal part of the mask and the external part of the mask. And as you drag it outward, you get less of a transition zone. Right? And you can see how it's changing over here as well, but you get less of a transition zone. So it's a less gradual transition between the areas most impacted by the mask and the areas that are less impacted by the mask. And you can drag this all the way out if you don't want any sort of transition zone. You can drag it all the way out to the external line if you need to. So that internal line, that internal handle is used primarily to control how smooth you want that transition to be on your mask. All right, and that's pretty much all there is to it. It's a fairly simple mask to use. What we'll do in the next section is actually show you how to apply this mask to a photo now that you have a better understanding of how they're created and how you can control the settings. So in the second part of this demo, we're actually going to apply a radial gradient mask to a specific part of the photo that you see on my screen at this point. We're going to focus in specifically on this piece of metal, this not sure what that is, but this piece of metal that we see in the open field. What we're going to do is create a radial gradient mask that covers that area and then just make some pretty simple changes and just kind of illustrate how that radial gradient mask works. So first thing I'll need to do is click on the mask button. That'll bring up the Create New Mask pane, and from there I'll click on Radial Gradient. And pretty easy process here, right? All you're going to do is simply draw in a radial gradient mask that focuses on the area that you want to cover. You may need to change your just mask overlay mode here. I had it set to something different, but the default for your mask overlay mode is going to be color overlay, which is what we're going to stick to for now. And then I'll kind of come back to that in just a bit. All right, so that's the initial mask that gets created. And you'll notice, especially with these radial gradient masks, they rarely cover, well, you can always get full coverage of the object that you're wanting to cover with a mask, but it almost always bleeds beyond the boundaries of the object that you're wanting to create a mask for. So you'll notice that obviously the mask is centered around this piece of metal, but the mask also bleeds outside of the areas of that metal. You can see this even more distinctly if you switch your mask overlay mode to some other option here like color overlay on black. Now you can really see the limits of that radial gradient mask, and you can see how it kind of bleeds out beyond the boundaries of what we're really wanting to focus on. And so there's other options here, right? Image on black and white, image on black, image on white. You got different options here, but these different options can kind of help you visualize your mask a little bit better at times. And so we'll kind of stick with color overlay on black and white at this point. I think that works pretty well for really enabling us to visualize exactly where that mask is and what its boundaries are. The first thing I'm going to do is just kind of shrink this down a little bit. It's a little bit too large for what we need here. Might need to move it just a bit. So that's a little bit better. Obviously, we've got some bleed over here, but we can take care of that later, should we need to do that. We'll just kind of shrink that down just a bit. Doesn't have to be perfect. You can also keep in mind you can rotate as well. Don't necessarily need to rotate here, but you've got these rotation buttons here that allow you to rotate your mask should you need to do that. In your internal handles, of course, the internal blue dot allows you to move the mask around on the page should you need to do that. You can see how you kind of move that around. And then the internal handle itself, if you drag it inward, it'll give you a more gradual effect for your mask. So you can see how it starts out very strong in the center, and then it gradually, as you're going towards the external handles, it has more of a feathering approach to it. So it's a very gradual rendering of the mask as you move this internal handle inwards. You can see this as well by looking at the radial gradient panel. You'll notice how it's set to a value of 85 at this point. The further you get towards 100, the closer you get to 100, the more gradual that blending will be. Now, if I extend this further out, you'll have a less gradual blending. You can see how the effect there as you move it out to, in this case, 19. Now I don't have a very gradual blending of my mask at all. It's pretty intensive inside that circle, and then it's a very quick fall off outside that. So I'm going to leave this fairly confined here. And that gets pretty decent coverage, right? And so from here, what I can do is of course, I can make my changes. I'm going to switch back here to color overlay mode, just so I can see the rest of the photo while I'm making the changes here. And so you might want to, I'll turn off the, all right, so at this point, I have a mask that covers just that particular area. Now I can go into the radial gradient panel and make my changes. So I might want to bump the exposure down a little bit. You can see when I'm making these changes, it only affects that one area of the mask. So I'll bump that down a little bit, bump the contrast up. It doesn't really matter what we're doing here. Just wanting you to mainly focus in on the fact that we're making changes to just that specific area. All right, so now once you're done, you probably want to clean this up a little bit. All right, if I show the overlay again, switch back to color in black and white, you can still see that, I've got definitely a bleed over effect here. And so what you probably want to do is clean this up a little bit. And we can do that pretty easily by going to the mask on this Create New Mask pane, going to the mask that you created and selecting Subtract. And then on this, probably the easiest way to do it is to brush it out. So I'll select Brush. And then all you're going to do is simply paint over the areas that you want to remove. So you can see how I'm removing the mask from the right side of that piece of metal. And I'm going to bring the density up here higher so I can make sure that I fully remove that mask. And that's the other thing. You got to keep in mind that these tools all work together. So I'm using the brush at this point to brush out or subtract out the areas where I don't really need the mask. And in a case like this, you want your density to be pretty high here. Actually, it should be 100 even. So you're wanting to brush out the areas that you don't want to mask. So you're just going to clean up the boundaries of this piece of metal where you've got mask spillover. I'm just going to clean this up. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? But just trying to illustrate some things here. We're just going to brush this out. Now this is going to look pretty good at this point. So now my mask generally covers the area that I want it. Right? There's still a little bit of bleed over in some of these areas, but it's pretty close. And so now if I switch back to color overlay mode, turn off the overlay, now we get the finished product. All right. So again, just to kind of recap what we've covered here, we've been looking at the radial gradient mask. Radial gradient mask is used in different circumstances to be able to do selective editing on your photos. It's most useful for selecting specific objects that you might want to highlight or make changes to. It's often used for vignetting effects as well. Those are probably the two primary reasons why you would use a radial gradient mask. And they're fairly easy to create and change the properties of. So that will bring us to the end of this video. I appreciate you guys for joining me, and we'll talk to you again soon.